Seattle, November. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself. A man stands outside a restaurant on 4th Avenue holding yellow tulips. His reservation is for 2. His phone just buzzed. He already knows what it says. He goes inside anyway. He sits at the table. Orders, tells the waiter she's running late. Watches couples lean toward each other under warm light while he counts the minutes between phone checks. Eats his pasta. Overtips. Leaves 8 blocks away. In a 3rd-floor apartment with a door that sticks. Unless you know the trick, a woman is sitting on the floor, surrounded by laundry she gave up folding. She's still awake. She doesn't know why she's still awake. She tells herself it's not because she's been listening for his key in the lock. She's been listening for his key in the lock. He turns the corner onto Clement Street. Tulips still in hand, jacket soaked through. Moving toward something he doesn't know is already waiting for him. The worst part about getting rejected isn't the rejection itself. It's the walk home. Holding flowers you don't know what to do with anymore. Timothy Marsh stood on the sidewalk outside Bellini's Italian Bistro on 4th Avenue, a paper cone of yellow tulips tucked under his left arm, and tried to remember how to breathe like a normal person. The rain hadn't decided yet. Just that Seattle mist that isn't quite rain but isn't not rain either. The kind that settles into your collar and makes everything smell like wet concrete and bad decisions. His phone was still in his hand. He'd read the message 4 times. Not because it was complicated, because some part of him kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less final. I'm sorry for the late notice, but I don't think I'm feeling the connection. You're a great guy, though. The name at the top was his, which meant Sandra had probably sent this exact text before. Maybe she kept it saved in her drafts like a template. Insert name here. You're a great guy, though. The gravestone engraving of modern dating. The participation trophy of romantic failure. 8 minutes. She'd waited until 8 minutes before the reservation. Not enough time to cancel without looking like a man who'd been drop-kicked in a Whole Foods parking lot. Not enough time to go home first. Just enough time to stand on a wet Seattle sidewalk holding flowers and have what his therapist, if he had one, would probably call a moment of reckoning. He went inside anyway. That's the part he would always leave out later, when he told this story, and he would tell it, eventually, to someone who mattered, sitting somewhere warm. He would skip the part where he went inside and sat down at the table and told the waiter she was running late. He would skip the part where he ordered the cheaper pasta because the good one suddenly seemed like too much money to spend on his own embarrassment. He would skip the 1 glass of red wine he drank too fast, and the way he kept his phone face up on the table like a man waiting for a pardon that wasn't coming. He would skip all of that, because in the version he would tell later, the important part started when he got home. The restaurant had low lighting and exposed brick, and the kind of small tables near the window, designed for couples who wanted to lean toward each other under warm light. Timothy sat at one of those tables alone, watched exactly 3 couples lean toward each other under warm light, and ate his pasta with the disciplined focus of a man refusing to check his phone every 30 seconds. He checked it every 45 seconds instead. The waiter, a young guy named Eric, according to the pin on his apron, never once made a face. That small mercy cost Timothy more than he expected. He would have handled pity. Pity he knew what to do with. But Eric just refilled his water and said, "Let me know if you need anything else," in a voice that asked no questions. And Timothy felt something in his chest that he couldn't name and didn't want to. He paid the check. Overtipped. Outside, the mist had graduated into actual rain. The paper around the tulips had started to soften at the edges. He thought about leaving them on the table, just walking away from the whole night. The flowers, the reservation, the careful version of himself, who had ironed this shirt and practiced being interesting in the mirror at 6:47 p.m., like a man who had forgotten that other people were not auditions. He didn't leave the flowers. He walked to the bus stop on 5th, stood under the shelter with 3 strangers, and held a soggy cone of tulips against his chest like it was evidence at a trial where the verdict was already in. The bus smelled like wet umbrellas and fast food. He stood the whole ride, 1 hand on the overhead rail, flowers tucked against his ribs. A woman across the aisle glanced at them, then at his face, then away quickly, in the way people look away when they've understood a situation and want to give a stranger the dignity of not being seen understanding it. He got off 2 stops early and walked the rest, because the rain had eased a little, because he needed the air, because if he got home too fast he would have to walk through the door and be a person who got stood up on a Tuesday night in November, and he wanted 3 more blocks of being nobody. Just a man walking in the rain with wet shoes and a damp jacket that smelled like garlic and humiliation, and everything he hadn't said at a table for two. He took 4 blocks instead of 3. The apartment building on Clement Street was 3 floors of old brick that had been somebody's ambitious renovation project in 1987, and nobody's since. The radiator on the 2nd floor made sounds at night that Timothy had spent months trying not to interpret as language. The front door required a specific combination of key, turn, and hip pressure he'd mastered in week 2. A small private skill, the kind you only develop when you've decided somewhere is actually home. He did it quietly at 9:52 p.m. Not sneaking. Just careful, because Nicole had a habit of falling asleep on the couch with documentaries still going and one sock somehow missing, and waking her up felt like interrupting something private. The living room lamp, when it was on. She was not asleep. Nicole Whitfield was sitting cross-legged on the floor, between the couch and the coffee table, surrounded by laundry she had clearly folded and then abandoned in a fit of what Timothy had come to recognize as moral exhaustion. The kind that hit after a 12-hour shift when you'd given everything to people who needed it and had nothing left for something as optional as putting clothes away. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went straight to the flowers, then to his face, the sequence. Flowers first, face second, told him she already knew. Not the details, but the shape of it. Oh no, quiet, not dramatic. Just the sound of someone who sees a thing and names it without flinching. Timothy tried for a smile. It came out crooked. Good evening to you too. She uncrossed her legs. Stood up, brushing a dryer sheet off her hip. You're home early. Technically, I stayed for the whole date. Her eyebrows pulled together. Technically? He held up the tulips. Exhibit A, the prosecution rests. She didn't make it. Nicole's face did that thing it did sometimes. The quick change thing, like a door opening and concern walking through before she'd decided to invite it. She worked pediatrics. She'd learned to read the room faster than the room knew it was being read. Timothy, just his name. No question mark, no trailing off. He dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the blue one she'd found at a thrift store in the U District, and declared perfect, which it was, and aimed for casual. Missed by about 6 feet, it's fine, very respectful. Efficient even. She crossed the room, stopped about 2 feet from him. What did she say? He pulled out his phone before his brain could vote against it. Handed it over. Maybe he wanted a witness. Maybe he just wanted proof he hadn't invented the humiliation. Nicole read it quietly. Her lips moved slightly on the last line. Then she looked up. He took the phone back and shoved it in his pocket. There it is. The participation trophy of modern dating. You were already at the restaurant. I was at the table. Something moved across her face. Complicated. Oh, Tim. And there it was. The dangerous part. Because sympathy from Nicole didn't feel like pity. It felt like being seen by someone who knew the difference between what you were showing and what you were carrying. And that feeling was worse than Bellini's. Worse than the waiter. Worse than 3 couples leaning toward each other under warm light while he counted the minutes between phone checks. I ate, he said, moving toward the kitchen. The evening wasn't a total loss. Eric and I developed a strong emotional bond. Eric, the waiter. He refilled my water 4 times. That's commitment. Did he let you down too? Only when I asked if he could bring me a more interesting personality to go with the pasta. A small laugh slipped out of her. Involuntary. The kind she didn't authorize. And just like that, the apartment stopped feeling like the inside of something he wanted to leave. She followed him into the kitchen and took the flowers from his hands indulgent before he decided to let go of them. Her fingers brushed his. Cool from the room, steady the way her hands were always steady, and the contact lasted half a second longer than necessary. He was probably just counting wrong. She found the mason jar under the sink, filled it. Began arranging the tulips with more attention than they deserved. Those soggy, slightly bedraggled tulips that had been meant to say I am thoughtful but not intense, and instead now said something closer to I survived the evening with my dignity mostly intact. Timothy leaned against the counter. Tried not to watch her hands. He watched her hands. Nicole had capable hands. Steady hands. The kind that had once reattached a button to his coat, while simultaneously delivering a full lecture on the societal irresponsibility of a grown adult man owning exactly 1 needle and 0 thread. Hands that looked smaller than they were until you actually watched what they were doing. You didn't have to bring those home, she said. What was I supposed to do? Leave them on the table like a Victorian ghost. You could have given them to someone. I just did. She paused. The mason jar sat between them on the counter. Yellow tulips leaning slightly left, toward the window, toward the streetlight coming through the rain-streaked glass. Neither of them moved, then she smiled. Not her usual smile, the quick, sideways one she used when he said something funnier than she wanted to admit. This one was quieter, almost careful, like she'd measured the distance before taking the step. Well, she said. Thank you, the refrigerator hummed. Rain ticked against the window. The kitchen was warm and small, and smelled like the herbal tea she'd been drinking, and the faint lavender of her fabric softener, and Timothy was standing close enough to touch the sleeve of her sweatshirt if he'd been the kind of man who did things without thinking them through first. He was not that kind of man, he cleared his throat. Don't thank me. They're rejection flowers. Might be cursed. I'm not scared, no? I handle toddlers who bite for 12 hours straight. Your cursed tulips don't intimidate me, he laughed. She leaned back against the counter across from him, arms loose at her sides. Something warm in her eyes that he didn't know how to categorize, and had spent 9 months not trying to save. He reminded himself save meant, don't ruin the rent situation. Safe meant, she's your friend, your good friend, the person who checks that you ate when you're deep in inventory week, and forgets to pretend she isn't checking. Safe meant the thing you say to yourself when the alternative is complicated, and the lease is 12 months, and you've already destroyed one future by not seeing clearly enough. Save meant, stop looking at the warmth in her eyes. He looked at the counter instead. The little chip in the laminate shaped exactly like the state of Idaho. He'd noticed it 3 weeks after moving in, on a Sunday morning, when they'd been sitting across from each other with coffee, and he'd pointed at it and said, that's Idaho, and she'd leaned over to look and said, that's not Idaho. Idaho's wider at the top, and they'd argued about the shape of Idaho for 11 minutes in a way that had felt, for reasons he still hadn't examined, like the most comfortable 11 minutes of his recent life. So, she said. The woman from the bookstore, Sandra, she's the one who called the first edition's vintage hardcovers. I overlooked that because she laughed at the right time. Tim, I know, was she even interesting? He looked at the Idaho chip, thought about it honestly, maybe for the first time. She was the idea of interesting. She had the right markers. She talked about books. She had good taste in coffee. She asked follow-up questions. But I kept... He stopped. Kept what? Kept having to remind myself to be interested. Like it was a job. Nicole didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't rush to fill silences. Most people did. Most people got uncomfortable when quiet settled and immediately started shoveling words into it. Nicole let silence be what it was. Were you excited about her? She asked finally. Actually, the question landed differently than he expected. Not on the surface where the easy answers lived. Somewhere lower, I was excited about being excited, he said. I thought if I could sit across from someone new and not compare everything to the mess with Rebecca, if I could just want something without calculating it first, that would mean something. Progress, maybe, Nicole knew about Rebecca. Not every chapter of it, but enough. The engagement that had ended 11 weeks before the wedding. The apartment he'd lost because the lease had been in her name. The version of himself he'd packed into boxes and carried to a storage unit and never fully unpacked, because some of what was in those boxes, he suspected, had been fiction to begin with. It is progress, Nicole said. Not loudly. Not with the kind of enthusiasm that was really just reassurance wearing a different outfit. Just evenly, like a statement of observable fact, getting stood up and coming home and telling the truth about it. That's not nothing. He looked at her then, because the way she said things sometimes, the specific absence of performance in it, hit him in places he'd sealed off after Rebecca, places he'd labeled under renovation, no entry, and genuinely believed were closed. That's annoyingly wise, he said. I'm off tomorrow. My wisdom has nowhere else to go. Lucky me, yeah, she said. And her voice dropped on it, just slightly, just a half step. Lucky you. The rain got heavier against the kitchen window. Nicole looked at the tulips, then back at him. Did you actually want to go on that date? Or did you want to go? Strange question, simple one, he thought about it. Really thought, the way he'd been avoiding all evening. I thought I did. I thought if I could feel it, feel the possibility of it, that would mean I was ready. Ready for what? To not be the man who still flinches when someone asks about the wedding. She absorbed that, didn't flinch from it the way most people did, the way people moved quickly past anything that required them to sit with someone else's hurt. Nicole just held it, like it was something worth holding. You don't flinch as much as you think, she said. You can't know that. I've watched you for 9 months, Timothy. I know where you tighten up, she said it simply. Not like a confession, like pointing at Idaho on the counter. That's Idaho. Just a thing she'd noticed and was naming. He cleared his throat. I should probably change out of my rejected man costume. She didn't move. He was almost at the hallway when she said it. Timothy, he stopped. Something in the way she said it. Not dry, not amused, not the Nicole voice that meant you left a dish in the sink again, made him turn around. She was standing at the edge of the kitchen. Both hands gripped the counter behind her, fingers curled over the edge. Her cheeks had gone pink. She looked, for the first time in 9 months of knowing her, like she'd surprised herself. What, a small laugh. No humor in it. Nothing, never mind. It's stupid, Nicole. Her eyes met his, and he could see it. Whatever she'd been about to say, she was currently in a full internal war about whether to say it, and the war was close, and neither side was winning by much. What? He said again. Quita. She let go of the counter, looked down, looked up. Looked like a woman who had spent some significant portion of 9 months making a very detailed plan to never say a particular thing, and was now standing at the exact moment when all that planning was about to become irrelevant. I wouldn't have turned you down. 6 words, the kitchen went completely still. Timothy stood in the hallway with one shoulder against the doorframe and tried to determine whether he had actually heard what he thought he'd heard, or whether 2 glasses of wine and an emotionally turbulent bus ride had started producing auditory hallucinations in the form of things he had absolutely, definitely, under no circumstances been hoping to hear. The refrigerator was still humming. The rain was still there. Nicole was still standing at the edge of the kitchen with pink cheeks, and her hands now pressed flat against the counter like she needed something solid. She looked like she wished she could reach into the air and pull the sentence back. What? He said. Not eloquently. She closed her eyes. Please don't make me repeat that. I'm not trying to make you. Then why aren't you saying anything? I'm trying to establish whether my brain added something. Her eyes opened. What would your brain add? Wishful thinking, apparently. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically. Just a small adjustment, like a lens finding focus. The pink in her cheeks deepened. She straightened slightly, which he'd learned meant she was deciding something, committing to a direction. I meant it the way it sounded, she said. The hallway had never felt like 6 feet before. He took one step toward her, stopped himself, took stock of the situation with what remained of his functional brain. They lived together. 12 feet of hallway between their bedroom doors. One decent frying pan between them. A lease with both their names on it. 9 months of careful, comfortable, genuinely wonderful coexistence that he would not blow up because he was emotionally compromised from a Tuesday rejection, and she was saying something that... She was still looking at him. He crossed the kitchen, not all the way. He stopped on the other side of the counter island. His hands found the back of a chair. Held it, Nicole. I know, she said. We lived together. I was present when I moved in. If this gets weird, yes, I know. I also know that weird is already here, Timothy, because you're standing there smelling like garlic and heartbreak, and I'm standing here having apparently lost the ability to keep my thoughts inside my face. He almost laughed. Let out a breath instead. Did you mean it? He stopped. Tried again. As a friend. Morally. Like you would have given me a chance out of basic human decency. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm giving you exits, he said. Take one if you want. The careful thing. The measured thing. The thing that had kept 9 months of shared space comfortable and uncomplicated. It moved aside. Just slightly. Just enough. I don't want an exit, she said. And the refrigerator hummed. And the rain came down. And Timothy Marsh stood in his own kitchen at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday in November, gripped tight on the back of a chair, realizing that the thing he'd been calling safe for 9 months had never actually been about safety at all. It had been about fear, which, it turned out, was considerably different. The thing about fear was that it wore good disguises. Timothy had spent 3 years thinking the thing he felt around Nicole was contentment. Comfortable. Easy. The relief of finding a living situation that worked, a person he genuinely liked, a daily routine that didn't require performance. After Rebecca, after the implosion of the person he'd been performing for 2 years before the engagement and 11 months after it, he'd been so deeply, bone-tiredly grateful for anything that didn't require him to be on that he'd called it friendship and stopped examining it. That was the lie, or not exactly a lie. More like a true thing he'd been reading wrong. I didn't plan to say it, Nicole said. Her voice had changed, lower, more careful, like she was picking her way across ice. For the record, I had a whole plan to not say it. Very thorough. Involved a lot of looking at the ceiling when you came out of the bathroom. His brain short-circuited on a specific image. He filed it under Do Not Process right now. I'm moving out, she said, covering her face with both hands. No, he said. Too fast. No hesitation, no thought, just the word, clean and immediate, the way you reached for something you were about to lose. She lowered her hands slowly, looked at him from across the counter. The word hung between them. It had said more than he'd meant to say, and they both knew it. He softened his voice. Don't. As your roommate. She said it carefully, testing the edges. He held her gaze. Not only as your roommate, she went still. For 3 full seconds, she was completely motionless. And Timothy had time to think about approximately 7 different ways this could go wrong, and then Nicole exhaled, and her whole face changed, and she said, When what? When did this start for you? Unfair question. You confessed first, that's exactly why I get to ask. She tilted her head. Waited. He looked at the Idaho chip. Of course he did. When you dance in the kitchen, I don't dance. You absolutely dance. I sway while stirring things. It's called rhythm. You nearly took out the garbage can during Earth, Wind and Fire last month. That garbage can was in the wrong place. The garbage can lives there, Nicole. It has always lived there. She was trying not to smile. Losing? When else? He rubbed the back of his neck, opened a door he'd kept locked for 9 months, and let himself actually look at what was on the other side. When you fall asleep on the couch and get mad at the documentary for continuing without you. She made a sound of protest. He kept going. When you bought my cereal during an inventory week and said it was because it was on sale, and I checked the store website and it was full price, her expression shifted. He didn't stop. When you call your patients your tiny dictators. When you leave me coffee before my early shifts. When you laugh and try not to. When you help me rebuild that bookshelf after I destroyed it, and you didn't once say I told you so, even though you had absolutely said so, twice, in advance, with diagrams. She was quiet. Her eyes had gone bright in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen light. He'd said too much. He knew he'd said too much. But he was 31 years old, and he'd spent 2 years building a life with a woman who ultimately told him you've never seen her clearly, and the whole wreckage of that. The apartment, the ring, the version of himself he'd had to dismantle and rebuild from parts, had started with one failure, not saying the true thing when he had it. He wasn't doing that again, not in this kitchen. Not with yellow tulips leaning toward the window. Not with Nicole Whitfield standing 6 feet away with pink cheeks and steady hands. And the most important question he'd been asked in 3 years, still hanging in the air between them. She came around the counter, slowly. The way you moved towards something you weren't sure would stay if you startled it. She stopped close enough that he could smell the lavender of her sweatshirt and the faint peppermint of the tea she'd been drinking, and she reached for his tie. The tie he'd worn for a woman who never showed, and loosened the knot with careful, deliberate fingers. His breath stopped. You're not leftover pieces, she said quietly. The tie slid free. She draped it over the back of the chair. Her fingers stayed lightly against his shirt front, not holding him, touching. Asking something without words, the way Nicole communicated when words were insufficient or too exposed. He covered her hand with his. She looked up. Her eyes, up close, were a shade of brown he'd never let himself properly catalog, and they were doing the thing she did when something mattered. That particular absence of pretense, that refusal to look away first. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. If Sandra hadn't canceled tonight, she stopped, pressed on. Would you have come home and kept pretending? He wanted to give her the kind answer. She deserved the honest one. Probably, he said. Because I'm good at pretending when I think the alternative could break something. She nodded. Tucked the answer somewhere behind her eyes. But you would have been pretending. Every single day. He didn't look away. That part matters. For a moment neither of them moved, then Nicole, who was practical even in the middle of things that weren't practical at all, glanced down at her pajama pants. Green plaid faded at the knees, a hole developing near the left pocket, and said, I would have worn better pants if I'd known. He looked down at them. Back up at her. I don't know. They're doing a lot of work. Don't flirt with my pants, Timothy. I'm flirting with the person in the pants. The pants are incidental. Her smile went sideways and helpless. The one she couldn't quite control. The one that meant she'd been caught actually feeling something. And that was the moment he understood, with the clarity you only get when you've finally stopped lying to yourself. That this wasn't about Sandra. Sandra had been the occasion, not the cause. This had been building quietly, steadily, in the spaces between grocery lists and borrowed umbrellas and Sunday mornings arguing about the shape of Idaho. He'd been standing at a door for 9 months calling it a wall. She led him to the living room. She moved the laundry off the couch, turned on the amber lamp that made the whole room warm and a little golden, and came back with the cheesecake she'd been saving for what she'd called a genuinely terrible day. Set it on the coffee table, went back for tea, came back, sat on the couch, patted the cushion next to her in a way that was simultaneously businesslike and completely devastating. "A do-over," she said, "right here. You answer my questions, I'll answer yours. And we'll see if this evening can be salvaged." He looked at the space next to her. The cheesecake, the lamp, the laundry she'd piled carefully to one side. He moved before fear could catch up with him, sat down. She was close enough that her knee almost touched his. Those 6 inches had never felt quite like this before. Ceremonial. Like a border that both of them could see. "Tell me about yourself," she said. "Straight-faced, Nicole, humor me," he exhaled. "I'm 31. I sell books to people who believe purchasing them counts as reading them. I make excellent scrambled eggs. I once cried during a dog food commercial, the one with the golden retriever." He had a whole backstory. "Green flag," she said, completely serious. "The crying? The eggs. I've been eating your eggs for 9 months. Those were roommate eggs," he said. "These would be different." She turned toward him slightly. "Different how?" He looked at her. The softness of the light catching the auburn in her hair, the small, careful set of her mouth, the way her hands were wrapped around her tea mug like it was something worth holding, and thought, "Because I'd be making them for you. Not for a person who happens to live here. For you specifically." He didn't say that yet. Instead, he said, "You'd have to try them to find out." Nicole Whitfield looked at him over the rim of her tea mug and smiled with her whole face. "Then I guess," she said, "you'd better make me breakfast." They reached for the cheesecake at the same time. Their hands collided over the plate. "Sorry," she said. "You first," he said. They both pulled back at the same time, looked at each other, then laughed, too loud for the quiet room, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from something funny, but from the sheer pressure of something that needs a release valve. "This is ridiculous," he said, completely. "I've watched you unclog the kitchen drain with a wooden spoon and the force of your own conviction. Why am I nervous to share cheesecake with you? Because now, if you take the last bite, it means something," she said. "Everything means something on a date, Tim. Is that what this is?" She looked at him directly. No hedging. "You tell me." He picked up the fork, cut a clean bite from the center, not too big, not too careful, lifted it toward her. The space between them compressed to just a fork with cheesecake on it, and her eyes watching his face. She leaned forward and took the bite. Her lips closed around the fork. The room went somewhere he couldn't follow for a moment, and when he came back the fork was empty and she was sitting back looking at him with an expression he was fairly certain his nervous system was not equipped to handle at full voltage. He set the fork down. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The word had different weights now. He felt his. She turned her mug between her palms. A quiet habit, something she did when she was processing. "Can I confess something else?" she said. "I'm starting to find your confessions more interesting than anything else that's happened to me tonight. I was jealous, flat, matter of fact. Like she was reading a vital sign, something landed in his chest. Of Sandra, I helped you pick that shirt." She looked at her mug. "I told you the blue one made your eyes do that annoying thing. And you left, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. You're allowed to date people. Obviously, a beat. But I kept picturing you at the table, doing the self-deprecating thing you do when you want someone to like you." Making her laugh. "And I kept thinking she was going to get the version of you I wanted before I was brave enough to ask for it." The apartment was so quiet he could hear the refrigerator making its slightly concerning sound. He turned toward her fully. "I think about you," he said. Not performing it. Just saying it the way he'd learned to say true things. Quietly, directly, without extra packaging. More than makes sense. More than I let myself acknowledge. He kept his eyes on hers. "I think about telling you when something good happens before I think about telling anyone else. I think about whether you ate on long shifts. I think about the way you explain things. How you find the actual center of something complicated and just point at it. A beat. I think about kissing you when you're yelling at the toaster." She laughed. Shaky and involuntary and real. "The toaster deserves it." "I know." His thumb traced once across her knuckles. "I didn't let myself want this because I was afraid I was still broken from Rebecca. I didn't want you to be the person I used to prove I could function again. You mattered too much for that." Her eyes went bright. She blinked once. "I'm not afraid of your broken parts," she said softly. "I am. Then let me help you carry them. Don't hand me only the version that's been cleaned up for company." She squeezed his hand. "I've been living with you for 9 months, Timothy. I've seen the 6 a.m. insomnia version, and the 3-day inventory week version, and the version that watches dog food commercials and cries about narrative arcs. I know what I'm asking for. He looked at her for a long moment. Can I kiss you? He said. Her answer was immediate, unhesitating. Yes. He leaned in slowly, gave them both the space to change their minds. Neither of them did. The first touch was soft, almost tentative, a question more than an answer. And then Nicole made a small sound somewhere in her throat and kissed him back. And the question got answered with considerable clarity. Everything he'd been holding at arm's length for 9 months arrived at once. The warmth of her hand in his, the weight of her leaning toward him rather than away. The impossible ordinariness of being in a living room he knew perfectly well, in an apartment with a complaining radiator and an Idaho-shaped chip on the kitchen counter, and feeling, for the first time since Rebecca, like he was somewhere he was actually supposed to be, not performing being there, not convincing himself the fit was good, just there. Correctly, when they separated, their foreheads touched. Nicole kept her eyes closed for a moment. He stayed close. The lamp was warm. The rain had steadied into something consistent and unhurried. Don't summarize it, she said. I was going to say it was worth the 9 months. She pulled back enough to look at him properly. The real smile, the one he'd been cataloging for 9 months without letting himself understand why, was fully present and unguarded. I'm going to be absolutely insufferable about being your best first date, she said. You set a low bar. My previous first date of the evening involved a full pasta course and no second party, Tim. All the dryness she had. I gave you cheesecake and kissed you. Sandra never had a chance. He kissed her again, shorter, warmer, like punctuation. They stayed on the couch until well past midnight, talking, occasionally not talking. The combination of closeness and ease that he'd thought was just friendship for 9 months, and now understood was friendship with a no-charge depth underneath it that had been waiting for someone to finally drop it. She told him about her parents' divorce when she was 12, which she'd handled by becoming preternaturally competent. The kid who had the answers, who had the plan, who was fine because fine was what the situation required. About how she'd chosen nursing, partly because being the person with the competence felt safer than being the person who needed it. About an ex named Marcus, who had been steady and decent and fundamentally wrong for her in a way neither of them had admitted for almost 2 years. Wrong how, he said. He wanted me to be comfortable. And I wanted to be, she considered it, necessary, not needed. There's a difference, I need you, he said. For the record, that's not good enough, I know. He shifted to look at her. I want you specifically. Not a warm body in the apartment, and not someone to manage my meals. You, the actual Nicole, including the toaster grievances, and the terrible plant care track record, and the way you fall asleep during documentaries, and then get personally offended that they continued. She made a noise. They should pause. Streaming services do not accommodate your sleep schedule. That's a design flaw. Strongly agree. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You're necessary to me. That's what I mean. She was quiet for a moment. I have a bad track record with this, she said. So do I. My last relationship ended because I was too competent. My last engagement ended because I wasn't present enough. So between us we have one complete relationship skill set. That's exactly how math works. She laughed, real and uncalculated. The one she couldn't control. He held on to it. Eventually they had to sleep. Which meant the hallway. Which meant 2 bedroom doors 12 feet apart. Which meant standing in the narrow space between those doors for what he would later estimate at 4 minutes. Holding hands, neither of them willing to manufacture the reason to let go. This is ridiculous, she said, completely. We're adults, arguably. I'm 12 feet away. I'm aware of the floor plan, Nicole. The hallway was dark except for the light from the living room lamp still on around the corner. Her face in that half-light had the quality of something he wanted to keep very precisely in his memory. She rose onto her toes and kissed him once more. Soft, no urgency. The kind of kiss that was complete in itself. Good night, Timothy. Good night, Nicole. She disappeared into her room. The door clicked shut. His phone buzzed, still not pretending. He stood in the dark hallway in his worn t-shirt, smiling at his phone like a man who had absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about and was going to be embarrassed about it anyway. Me neither. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a while. Not from anxiety. From the wide-awake quality of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has, in the span of one unlikely Tuesday, set it down. The apartment breathed around him. Nicole's light, the thin line under her door, stayed on a little longer, which meant she was also awake, which was a comfort he hadn't expected to feel and felt completely. He'd been staring at the ceiling water stain for 9 months from one side of this apartment, and 12 feet away she'd been staring at her own ceiling from the other side, and between them something had been building that neither of them had been naming yet, until Tuesday. Until the empty chair at Bellini's, and the rain and the tulips, and the 6 words that had started as a plan to never say anything, and had landed in a kitchen, between 2 people who were very tired of pretending not to see what was right in front of them. He closed his eyes. Necessary, not needed. There's a difference. He'd understood what she meant immediately, not the need for function or comfort or the relief of not being alone, but the kind of necessary that was specific, that had a shape and a name, that couldn't be substituted without being lost entirely. He'd sold books for 4 years. He understood necessary. He woke up at 6:14 a.m. with one thought, one single thought. He kissed Nicole, then immediately a second thought arrived. The eggs. He'd promised eggs, which meant he had to get up, walk into that kitchen, and be a person who had kissed his roommate the night before, and now needed to operate a spatula with some degree of normalcy. Completely manageable, he lay on his back staring at the ceiling for 11 minutes. The ceiling had a water stain in the upper left corner, shaped roughly like the continental United States if you squinted and had nothing better to do. He'd spent approximately 40 minutes total staring at it across 9 months of early mornings. It had never felt particularly significant before. Now it felt like a metaphor for something he wasn't ready to name before coffee. He got up at 6:25. The hallway was empty. Nicole's door was closed. He moved quietly to the kitchen, filled the coffee maker, stared at it while it worked, the way a man stares at coffee equipment when he has too many thoughts and not enough caffeine to sort them with. The mason jar was still on the counter. The tulips were a little more open now than they'd been last night. The warmth of the apartment had coaxed them, the way warmth coaxes most things that have spent time in the cold. They tilted slightly toward the window. Morning light was coming through, pale and watery, the quality of Seattle November light that suggested the sun was doing its best under difficult circumstances. He stood there looking at the flowers for a moment. Then he got out the eggs. He heard her at 7:08. Not footsteps exactly, more like the acoustic signature of Nicole Whitfield navigating her morning. The particular quality of her door opening, the pause at the bathroom, the way she moved through the apartment with the controlled economy of someone who'd worked nights and learned not to create unnecessary sound. He had the eggs going. Coffee was done. 2 mugs on the counter. Not staged, just where they always ended up. Same 2 spots that had become theirs through repetition rather than decision. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, old sweatshirt. Hair piled in the arrangement that happened when she slept on it wet. Yesterday's mascara doing something complicated under her eyes that he was completely confident she didn't know about. She looked at him. He looked at her. The room held the weight of last night between them. Just for a second. Just long enough to confirm it had actually happened. "You're already making eggs," she said. "I made a promise. I didn't think you'd actually." She stopped. "You're up at 6:25. On your day off. The eggs don't know it's my day off." He turned back to the pan. "Coffee's ready." She moved to the counter, wrapped both hands around a mug. He heard the small sound she made when coffee was hot enough and strong enough, which was a sound he'd catalogued somewhere around month 2 without understanding why it had registered. Timothy, the way she said his name. Not the careful version from last night. This was morning Nicole, Quieter. The version that existed before the day required her to be anything in particular. "Yeah," he said. "Are we being weird?" He thought about lying. Decided against it. Yes, bad weird or good weird. He turned around. She was leaning against the counter with her mug, watching him with the expression she used when she was assessing something. Not cold, not clinical, just the particular focus she brought to things that mattered. He crossed the kitchen. Didn't think about it, just moved. Set his spatula on the counter, walked the 6 feet between them, and stopped in front of her close enough that she had to tip her chin up slightly to keep looking at his face, her breath caught, just once. "Just a small intake, good weird," he said. Then he bent down and kissed her. It was a morning kiss. Warm and slightly clumsy, because she was still holding her coffee mug and he'd moved without a plan, and halfway through it she started to smile, which made the kiss less of a kiss and more of a shared smile with contact, which was somehow better. Her free hand came to his waist. Fingers curled into his t-shirt, checking if he was real. He understood that. He was doing the same thing. When he pulled back, her eyes were bright. "Good weird," she said. "Very. Okay." She lifted her mug back to her mouth. Go finish the eggs before you burn them. I'm not burning them. The smoke detector disagrees. He turned around. The eggs were not burning. They were, however, very close to the threshold of no return. He got there in time. She stole shredded cheese from the bowl while he plated. That's an ingredient, he said. That's a tax. You're taxing my eggs. You kissed me before I'd had coffee. The tax is justified. He pointed the spatula at her. For the record, I would do it again. She smiled into her mug. Quiet, deliberate. The kind of smile that had somewhere to be. For the record, she said, I'd let you. The eggs nearly burned a second time. They ate at the small table by the window, knees occasionally bumping underneath. Because the table was designed for one person, and they'd always sat across from each other anyway, everything was the same. Everything was completely different. The apartment hadn't changed. The table hadn't changed. The Idaho chip on the counter was still Idaho. The radiator was still making its Wednesday morning noises. All of it was exactly as it had been last night before everything shifted. Except now he wasn't pretending. That was the only difference. And the weight of not pretending, the simple, staggering lightness of it, was something he didn't have a ready category for. Nicole traced the rim of her mug with one finger. The loose, comfortable quiet they'd built over 9 months settling back around them. With something new under it now, like a frequency change. Same station. New signal. I have to ask a practical thing, she said. I hate that I have to ask a practical thing, then ask it and we'll figure it out. She looked up. If this doesn't work, do we lose everything? There it was. The question that lived under all the warmth of last night. He wanted to promise her they wouldn't. Wanted to say they were too careful, too honest, too fundamentally good at being in the same space to ever curdle it. He'd been 30 years old and engaged once. He knew that love didn't come with a guarantee. I don't want to lose you, he said. That's not an answer, I know. He put his hand on the table, palm up. She looked at it for a moment before placing hers in it. I can't promise we won't get scared. I can't promise I won't overthink things or shut down when I'm overwhelmed or panic, because good things have historically preceded significant structural collapse in my life. Her fingers tightened. But I can promise I won't punish you for being brave first, he said. And I won't let you carry the whole risk by yourself. If we do this, and I want to do this, Nicole, I want to be very clear that I want to do this. We do it on purpose. Both of us. Not because we're lonely and convenient. Because I want you specifically. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him last night. That quality of attention he'd felt on his skin for 9 months, and called something else. I want to take you on an actual date, he said, outside this apartment, with shoes on. I want to hold your hand somewhere that isn't our couch and find out if you still make fun of me in public. I will, she said. No hesitation. Good. Tonight, she stared. You move fast for a man who spent 9 months pretending not to notice me. I have a backlog to work through. She laughed. Stood still holding his hand, and came around the table and sat down on his lap. Not tentatively, not like a question, but with the decisive casualness of someone who had decided something and was acting on it. His hands found her waist instinctively. She reached up and smoothed the hair at his temple, just once. Just a small, deliberate thing. I'm scared too, she said quietly. I know, but I don't want to go back to pretending. Neither do I. She kissed him then. Deeper than the morning kiss. More certain, the kind of kiss that wasn't asking anymore. He held her carefully for exactly 1 second before she made the small impatient sound that meant he was being unnecessarily cautious, and he stopped being cautious. When she pulled back, she was breathing differently. Tonight, she said, actual date. Not Bellinis, never again, and no tulips. He glanced at the mason jar. I thought they were witnesses. She looked at them. Something soft in her expression. Exactly, they stay here. This is their place now. He changed his shirt 3 times. The first was the blue one. He put it on, took it off. Too much like trying. The second was the green flannel. Too casual. Too much like he was going to the hardware store. The third was a dark gray button-down he'd forgotten he owned, found in the back of the closet behind a jacket he hadn't worn since Portland. He put it on, looked in the mirror, looked like himself. That seemed right. He was sitting on the couch at 6:53 p.m. trying to appear as though he had not spent the last 20 minutes in a shirt-related crisis when Nicole's door opened. She was wearing a green dress he had never seen before. Not formal, not trying too hard. Just a soft, dark green that made him think of the kind of autumn evening when the light goes gold right before dark. Simple sleeves. A cardigan over it that she was still settling onto her shoulders as she came down the hall. Dark boots, hair down. She saw him looking and her chin came up half an inch. That bad? That unfair, he said. Her cheeks went pink. She looked down, smoothing the front of the cardigan. You're going to make this insufferable. You look beautiful. That's a statement of observable fact. I'm allowed to observe facts. Fine. She picked up her bag. You look good too. That's the least enthusiastic compliment I've ever received. Your gray shirt does something to your shoulders. I'll take that. She reached past him to get her keys, not quite touching him, but close. He caught the cedar and vanilla that had lived in his nervous system since approximately month 3 under the label Nicole's perfume, do not engage. Then she held the door open. Come on, Marsh. You promised me a real date. He went. The diner was called Ray's and it had been on the corner of Clement and 15th since 1974, according to the hand-lettered sign inside the door. Red vinyl booths, black and white tile floor, spinning counter stools, coffee in thick mugs that held heat like they were personally committed to it. A pie case near the door with a handwritten card. Homemade, daily, no exceptions, 6 blocks from the apartment. He had walked past it approximately 200 times. He had never once gone in. You've been here before, she said, settling into the booth across from him. Never, seriously, she looked at him. You walk past this place every day. I kept meaning to. That's a very Timothy thing. She picked up the laminated menu, meaning to do things that are right in front of you. He looked at her over his own menu. I'm going to let that one go. That's growth. Carol, the waitress, mid-50s, efficient in the way of someone who'd been taking diner orders since before Timothy was born, came and went. They ordered soup, and the thing that surprised him was how it felt. Not like the pressure of Bellini's, not the weight of a table set for 2 with 1 chair empty. Just the comfortable, breathing, genuinely enjoyable reality of eating soup across from someone whose company he'd wanted since, before he'd admitted it to himself. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the lease or the chore chart or anything that needed managing. She told him about a patient from last week, a 4-year-old who'd been brought in at 2 a.m., insisting that her stuffed elephant needed medical attention and who had refused to be examined until the elephant had been examined first. He told her about a customer who had been working through every Pulitzer Prize winner since 1948 in order and had shown up last Tuesday in a quiet panic because the 1963 winner was out of stock. Did you find it? She said. Found a copy at the half-price books in Capitol Hill. Drove over on my lunch break. She set her mug down, looked at him. You drove to Capitol Hill on your lunch break for a stranger. He needed the 1963 Pulitzer. Timothy, the integrity of the project was at stake. That's why She stopped. He waited. She shook her head slightly, smiled, didn't finish the sentence. But he heard the shape of it anyway, heard what lived at the end of that incomplete thought. And something in him recognized it the way you recognize a song you've heard 100 times in another room, finally hearing it clearly. They walked home slowly. The rain had stopped. The air had gone that clean cold that came in November, when Seattle's decided to be honest about its temperature for once. At the corner of Clement and 12th, 2 blocks from home, she hooked her pinky around his. He looked down at their hands. She kept looking straight ahead. Don't make it a whole thing. I'm not making it anything. You have the face again. My face is completely. Tim. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He turned toward her on the sidewalk, under the amber light of the corner street lamp, and he took her hand properly. Turned it and laced his fingers through hers, the way he'd wanted to for. He wasn't going to count how long. He was a reasonable man and some numbers were not worth arriving at. She looked at their hands, then at him. There, he said. There, she agreed, just as quietly. Back at the apartment, she stopped in the middle of the living room and turned around. Her cardigan was slightly damp at the shoulders from the walk. Her earrings caught the light when she moved. Good date, she said. Best date. That's a low bar, Timothy. Your previous first date of the evening involved eating alone. Still best date, she smiled. Then, quieter. I don't want to pretend. I want to go to my room. Then stay, he said. They changed into sweats, which was the most practical and somehow the most intimate thing that had happened all evening. Not because of any drama in it, but because it meant this was real. Real enough to exist in comfortable clothes rather than the performance of a date. She came back in the plaid pajama pants and the old Portland State sweatshirt with a small bleach stain on the left cuff. He came back in sweatpants, and the t-shirt she'd once told him was too worn to keep wearing. He'd kept wearing it anyway. She settled onto the couch. He sat beside her. Not 6 inches this time. Closer. She reached sideways without looking, and he put his arm up and she tucked herself under it, her head finding the space between his shoulder and his jaw, with the efficiency of someone discovering that a thing fits. It fit. He exhaled slowly. The lamp was amber. The radiator was doing its thing. Outside, Seattle was being Seattle. "I need to tell you something," she said eventually. "Okay, I don't want to be your consolation prize." She shifted slightly to look at him. "I know you've said I'm not. I believe you said it. But sometimes people believe things in the moment that they stop believing when the moment is over. And I need you to know. If this starts to feel like you're filling a gap rather than choosing me, I need you to tell me that. I will, promise." He lifted her hand, pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Not a dramatic gesture, just the nearest way he had to say, "I mean this. I promise." She searched his face for the clause, the hedge, the place where the promise got smaller in the fine print. She didn't find one. "And I need to promise you something," she said. "I'm not going to use the fact that my shampoo is already in the bathroom as a substitute for actually showing up. I want the whole thing, the asking, the choosing, the dates where we have to figure out what we are outside the context of a lease. I want us to build it on purpose. That's what I want." You're sure? He thought about that restaurant table, the empty chair, the pasta that cost less than what he'd budgeted for the evening, the waiter who'd been kind about it, the walk home in the rain with flowers he hadn't known what to do with. And he thought about the kitchen, the mason jar. 6 words from a woman who had apparently been standing at the same door he'd been standing at, from the other side, for 9 months, waiting to see if either of them would knock. "I'm sure," he said. "I don't want this because Sandra canceled. I want this because when you said you wouldn't have turned me down, the first thing I felt wasn't relief." He paused, let himself say it accurately. It was recognition. "Like some part of me had been waiting a long time for you to say it out loud." She went completely still. "That's not a line," he said. "It's just true." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moving through her face that he'd learned by now was Nicole processing something that had actually gotten through. Past the nurse's calm, past the practical intelligence, past the careful management of her own emotions she'd developed from years of being the person other people leaned on. Getting through to the actual Nicole, the one who'd held the counter with both hands and said 6 words that changed his Tuesday. She climbed into his lap, decisive, not asking. Her hands framed his face. He had exactly half a second to register that this was real, actually happening, before she kissed him. Not careful, not asking a question, and swearing one. The following Thursday, Nicole went back to work. 12-hour shift, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., which meant she was up at 5:45 and out the door by 6:20. He woke up at 6:15, not on purpose, but his internal clock had apparently been calibrated to her schedule for longer than he'd acknowledged, and made a coffee and poured it into her travel mug and left it on the counter. She texted him from the hospital parking lot at 6:19. "You left me coffee. You looked cold. You couldn't see me. I wasn't there yet. I had reasonable confidence you would be cold." A long pause. "Stop making me smile in a hospital parking lot. It's a very specific aesthetic I have going." He put his phone down, finished his own coffee, went to work. She came home at 7:40 p.m. with the kind of exhaustion that distinguished a genuinely hard shift from a merely long one. Hard shifts produced a quiet that was different from tired quiet. Denser, more interior, the quiet of someone who'd had to hold a lot and hadn't yet set it down. "Eat," he said, "please." He'd made soup. Not the adventurous choice. The right choice. She ate at the counter standing up, which was something she did after difficult shifts. Sat down later. Once she'd eaten enough to remember she was off the clock. He stayed nearby without crowding her. Refilled her water glass. Didn't ask what happened. She was halfway through the soup when she said, "Lost one today." He put his hand on the counter near hers. Not covering it, just close. "I'm sorry," she nodded. Ate some more, 4 years old. Congenital heart defect, we knew it was coming. Knowing doesn't actually help. No, the mother was still expecting a different outcome, right up until. And I've seen that 100 times and I still don't know how to watch it. He waited. "I told her he knew she was there," Nicole said. "I don't know if that's true. I think it is. But mostly I said it because there was nothing else to say and silence felt worse. It's probably true, probably isn't very comforting, no. But you were there." That's the part she'll remember. Nicole looked at him. And underneath the nurse's steadiness, something tired and sad and real that she was letting him see, because she'd decided he was someone who could hold it. He took her free hand. Held it. She finished the soup. Later they sat on the couch, her feet tucked under her, his arm around her, the TV on to something neither of them was watching. Around 9 o'clock she was asleep, head on his shoulder. He stayed still, let her sleep. Felt the satisfaction of a man who had been precisely where he was needed. He eased out from under her carefully and found the blanket that lived over the arm of the couch. She fell asleep here regularly, had from the beginning, and the blanket had been a functional accommodation he'd made around month 2, and covered her with it. She made a small sound but didn't wake. He turned off the TV, left the lamp on low, went to bed. This time he slept immediately. The following Saturday, 8 days after the Tuesday that had started everything, was when Scott Mercer happened. Timothy had not thought about Scott Mercer in approximately 4 months. Scott had been a sales rep at the distribution company he'd briefly worked for after college. A decent enough person in the way that people who are not particularly interesting are decent. Reliably pleasant, reliably unoriginal, carrying with him the energy of a man who had been exactly where he expected to be at every stage of his life and found this entirely satisfying. They ran into each other at the farmer's market on Pike Street. Timothy was there for the honey from the vendor near the north entrance, in Nicole's considered and frequently stated opinion, the only honey worth using. He was buying 2 jars because one was never enough. He heard his name, Scott Mercer. 5'11", fleece vest, the handshake of a man who'd read a book about handshakes and taken notes. They talked for 6 minutes. Scott covered his job, his new apartment in South Lake Union, a trip to Colorado in the fall, and then, with the casual precision of someone working up to it, glanced past Timothy's left shoulder. "Is that your roommate?" Timothy turned. Nicole was at a booth 3 vendors down in a red jacket, talking to the woman who sold the winter squash. "Nicole, yeah," Timothy said. "Huh." Scott watched her for a moment. "Are you two?" "We're together," Timothy said. Seal, no hesitation. The first time he'd said it out loud to anyone outside the apartment, and it arrived with a clarity that surprised him. Scott looked at him, then at Nicole, then back. "Huh. What? Nothing, just..." Scott did the casual but not casual thing. "Isn't she your roommate? Like you've been living together. So this is it actual dating? Or is it more like you got comfortable and then, we're together?" Timothy said again, equally simply. Closing the door, Scott raised both hands. "Hey, no judgment. You went through a lot with Rebecca. I guess I'm wondering if you're sure it's not easier to stay with someone you already live with than to actually..." Scott stopped. "We're together," Timothy said. A third time. Not aggressive. Just true. "Have a good Saturday." He walked toward Nicole. She was finishing her conversation when he reached her. She handed him one of her bags. Automatic, the gesture of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms, and then looked at his face. "What happened to your face?" she said. "I ran into someone I used to work with." She looked past him. Scott Mercer was departing in the direction of his fleece vest and his South Lake Union apartment. "What did he say?" she said. He exhaled. "He asked if this was actual dating or if we just got comfortable." Quiet. She adjusted the strap of her bag, thought about whether to be annoyed on his behalf or practical or something else. "What did you say?" she said. "I said, we're together." "How many times?" 3. A corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile yet. Did it help, saying it out loud? Yes. He looked at her, considerably, reached over and took the bag back from him. "Good," she said, "because we are." She moved toward the next booth on the list. Didn't look back. "Also, you got the honey, 2 jars, good. 1 is never enough." He didn't tell her about the rest of what Scott had said until that night. Because that was the thing about Tuesday Timothy. The one who'd said probably, "Because I'm a coward." He was trying not to be that person anymore. Not performing the okay version, saying the thing. He said it at 9:30 p.m., sitting on the kitchen floor. He wasn't sure how they'd ended up on the kitchen floor. It had started as a conversation at the table and migrated downward by degrees. His back against the cabinet under the sink, her back against the cabinet opposite, the length of the kitchen between them. Not hostile distance. Thinking distance. "He made me wonder," Timothy said. She waited. "Not about us." "About me," he looked at the floor. "About whether I know the difference between choosing you and choosing not being alone. After Rebecca. After losing the apartment and the version of myself that had that plan. I spent a long time being grateful just to be stable. And I need to know the difference." "Do you?" she said finally. "Yeah, how? Because when Rebecca left, the first thing I felt..." He paused, found the precise truth of it. "The first thing I felt was something close to relief. Relief that I wouldn't disappoint her anymore. Relief that the performance could stop." He raised his eyes to hers. "When I think about losing you, what I feel is completely different. It's not relief-shaped at all. It's the feeling of something going missing that doesn't have a replacement." She held his gaze, steady. "Taking the measure of it, that's the difference," she said. "Yeah." She moved across the kitchen floor. Not dramatic, not rushing, just crossing the distance because it needed crossing, and sat beside him, back against the same cabinet, shoulder touching his. "I know you see me," she said. "You know how I know? How 3 weeks ago I stopped eating lunch on shift. For a week. Not intentionally, I just kept running short on time, and by the time I had a window I wasn't hungry." She paused. "You noticed. You didn't ask about it. You didn't make it a conversation. You just started leaving crackers and an apple by the door every morning so I'd have something to grab." Her shoulder pressed slightly harder against his. "You didn't do that for a person-shaped space in your apartment. You did that for me." He hadn't thought she'd noticed the crackers. Of course she'd noticed the crackers. "I see you," he said. Not a reassurance, a statement of fact. "Not who I want you to be. You, the toaster and the documentary grievances, and the way you cry exactly once after the hardest shifts, and then don't mention it again." He turned his head to look at her. "You, specifically." She looked back at him. The mason jar on the counter had new tulips. She'd picked them up at the farmer's market that morning, replacing the originals, yellow again, the same yellow. A deliberate choice she hadn't explained, and he hadn't asked about. The new ones leaned toward the window, already learning where the light was. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Okay." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Now stop doubting the obvious thing and help me figure out what we're doing for Thanksgiving." He blinked. "It's the first week of November. Thanksgiving is in 3 weeks. My sister will ask about my plans," she said. "And I want a plan, and I'd like to not have a separate plan from yours if that's something we're doing now. So, are we doing a thing?" He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "We're doing a thing," he said. She picked up her phone to text her sister. He sat on the kitchen floor in the apartment that had stopped being a practical arrangement somewhere around month 3 and become, incrementally, undeniably, without drama or announcement, home. With Nicole Whitfield's shoulder against his, the new tulips watching from the counter, and Thanksgiving 3 weeks away, he was, it turned out, exactly where he was supposed to be. He just needed a rainy Tuesday and a text that arrived 8 minutes too late to figure that out. Thanksgiving happened. That sentence sounds simple. It was not simple. Nicole's sister was named Laura, and Laura lived in Tacoma, 45 minutes south on I-5, and Laura had the quality of older sibling that involved asking clarifying questions in a tone that implied the answer was already known and being evaluated. She was 34, a project manager. She had, according to Nicole, never once in her life left a sentence unfinished if she felt the full sentence would be more useful. Timothy heard about Laura for 9 months without meeting her. He met her on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving when she drove up to help with prep because Nicole had volunteered them to host, a decision Nicole had made approximately 48 hours after the Thanksgiving conversation on the kitchen floor, with the velocity of a woman who had decided and was not interested in second-guessing the decision. He was in the kitchen when Laura arrived, chopping onions for the stuffing. Not a metaphor. Actual onions. He heard the door. He heard Nicole. Then he heard a voice that was Nicole's voice but in a different register. Slightly more careful, slightly more formal. The way people speak to family members they love and find exhausting in equal measure. Then Laura appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him, then at the onions, then at the apartment, the quick surveyor's scan of someone noting details. She had Nicole's eyes but deployed them differently, with more visible calculation. "You're Timothy," she said. "I am. Nicole said you were the bookstore guy, also accurate." A pause. "She said you're good at eggs. I've had good reviews." Laura looked at the tulips on the counter. The third set by now, yellow again, still in the mason jar, a detail that had apparently been reported to her in some capacity because something moved in her expression when she saw them. Recognition. Approval. Foshurit, quickly, "Good," she said, and walked fully into the kitchen and began unloading the bag she'd brought with the efficiency of a woman who had places to be within a place. That was his introduction to Laura Whitfield. Thanksgiving itself was 8 people around a folding table that extended the kitchen table into the living room, with mismatched chairs sourced from their own apartment, the neighbors across the hall, and a folding chair Nicole had kept in her closet since her Portland apartment for reasons she'd never explained. His coworker Diane and her husband. A friend of Nicole's from the hospital named Priya, who laughed at everything and meant it. Laura's boyfriend, a quiet civil engineer named Daniel, who spoke infrequently and accurately, which Timothy respected immediately. Nicole moved through all of it the way she moved through difficult shifts, with the contained efficiency of someone holding multiple threads simultaneously and refusing to drop any of them. She directed the table setup while monitoring the oven, while tracking whether everyone had a drink, while answering Laura's questions about the stuffing recipe, with the patience of someone answering questions about a stuffing recipe for the third time. Timothy watched her from across the kitchen, not covertly, not the 9 months version of watching, where he'd been cataloging without permission, openly, with the full awareness that he was watching and the freedom to let it show. She caught him at some point, raised one eyebrow. He shrugged. She shook her head slightly, the smile underneath it, the one she couldn't control, and went back to the gravy. Laura noticed. Of course Laura noticed. Laura noticed everything. That was the project manager in her. She cornered him in the hallway during the 15 minutes before dinner, when everyone was in motion between rooms. Not aggressive, just pointed. She's been different, Laura said, directly. No preamble. Different how, he said, since the beginning of November. She texted me more. Not more often, different things. She used to text me logistics. Now she texted me about things that happened. Laura looked at him steadily. Last week she texted me that someone left crackers and an apple by the door on her hard days. He didn't say anything. She didn't say who, Laura said. She didn't have to, quiet. She hasn't been light like this since before Marcus, Laura said. Maybe before that, a beat. I don't say this as a threat. I say it as data. She doesn't let herself be light easily. It costs her something, another beat. So, he said. Laura studied him for one more second, then nodded. The single decisive nod of a project manager closing an agenda item. Good, she said, and walked back to the living room. Dinner was loud and warm, and ran 2 hours over the estimated timeline. Diane told the story of how she and her husband had met at a parking lot in 1987, and made everyone at the table understand that most romantic origin stories were simply conflicts that went a different direction. Daniel, the civil engineer, said 4 things the whole evening, but each of them was precise enough to be worth waiting for. Priya laughed. Laura assessed. Nicole's hand found his under the table at some point during the second hour, and just stayed there. He did the dishes, not alone. Daniel helped. They stood at the sink in the comfortable quiet of 2 men who didn't need to fill silence, working through the stack methodically, and Daniel said exactly one personal thing the whole time. She was alone for a long time before you, not accusatory, not warning. Just a fact offered plainly by a man who communicated in the currency of observable data. I know, Timothy said. Good, Daniel said, and handed him a pan to dry. That was the end of that. December arrived with the Seattle personality of a month that had decided not to pretend about the temperature anymore. Cold and clear in the mornings. Dark by 4:30. The kind of weather that made the inside of things feel more significant. The warmth of a room, the amber of a lamp, the fact of not being alone. He and Nicole built December around each other without announcing they were doing it. Her schedule was unpredictable. Pediatric nursing in winter was not a gentle occupation. Cold and flu season, the particular cruelty of children getting sick at Christmas. Parents arriving at 2 a.m. with the terror of people who had not anticipated that small bodies were fragile. She came home some nights with the dense quiet of a hard shift, and some nights with the lighter exhaustion of a long but manageable one. And he had learned the difference well enough to calibrate. Hard shift, soup, low lamp, no questions, proximity without demand. Long shift, she wanted to talk. She wanted to process. She wanted to sit across from someone and report what had happened and have it received by a person who would neither catastrophize it nor minimize it. He was good at receiving things. She told him that once, directly, with the simplicity she brought to observations that mattered to her. You receive things well. You don't try to fix them or reframe them. You just hold them. She'd been quiet for a moment after saying it. That's harder to find than people think. He thought about that for days, because it was something he hadn't known about himself. He'd spent 3 years since Rebecca cataloging his failures. The not seeing, the performing, the building of a future around a person he'd loved but not known. And in that inventory he'd missed some things. He hadn't listed receiving as a skill, but she'd named it, and now he knew he had it. That was the thing about being actually seen by someone. You discovered parts of yourself you hadn't been able to locate from the inside. He started leaving the coffee earlier on hard weeks. Not a big gesture. Just coffee, travel mug, counter, 6:15 a.m., every day of a hard run, regardless of whether she remembered to ask. She noticed. She always noticed. She just didn't always say so, and he had learned to read that as its own form of acknowledgement. The Nicole version of "I see what you're doing and it matters" was the way she looked at the mug on her way out the door. Not surprised anymore, just registering it. The way you register a thing that has become reliable. He was trying to be reliable. Not the performing reliability way he'd managed with Rebecca, the surface version, the showing up on the right days with the right things, the actual version. The kind that came from paying attention and acting on what you noticed and not needing credit for it. She was rereading a book in the second week of December when he came home to find her on the couch at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, the amber lamp, the book held slightly too close. Bad week, he said. Not a question, 2-year-old with meningitis, she said. Not looking up from the book, he's going to be fine. It was close, a beat. It was very close. He went to the kitchen, made tea, brought it out, set it on the table next to her without interrupting her page. Sat at the far end of the couch, not hovering, available. She read for another 40 minutes. He read too. They existed in parallel. The lamp, the tea getting cool, the sound of pages turning at different intervals. When she set her book down, she said, "You know what I thought about in the car on the way home?" "What?" "That you'd have tea ready." She looked at him. "I thought about it at the end of the shift when I was so tired I couldn't feel my feet. And I thought, Timothy will have tea ready, and that was enough." She paused. "Just that. Just knowing he held that. Is that what it is?" He said. "When it's right." She considered it. "I think so. I think it's when the thought of someone makes the hard things smaller. Not gone. Just smaller." He thought about the crackers. About all the small, sustained things that added up over time to a life built with intention rather than accident. "Yeah," he said. "That's what it is." Christmas was 3 days at his parents' house in Spokane. 6 hours east on I-90 through the Cascades, where the snow got real and stayed real. Not the Seattle version that threatened and retreated, but the Eastern Washington version that committed. He'd told his mother about Nicole in early December. His mother's name was Ruth, and she had the quality of certain women who expressed love through feeding and a logistical preparation, and the occasional precise question that went directly to the center of something you'd been hoping to skirt. "Is she good for you?" Ruth had asked. "Yes, are you good for her?" The pause there, the honest pause. "I'm trying to be." Ruth had been quiet for a moment. "That's the right answer," she'd said. "Bring her." Nicole had met the suggestion with characteristic directness. "Your parents' house. For Christmas, a beat. That's a significant move, Timothy. I know your mother will be. She'll be Ruth," he said. "Which means she'll feed you constantly and ask you one pointed question that goes straight to something you'd rather not discuss, and then never mention it again." "What's the pointed and question she asked you?" "Whether I was good for you." Quiet. "What did you say?" She said. "That I was trying to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll pack Thursday night." They drove out on the 23rd. 6 hours through the mountains with coffee in the cup holder and the radio on a station that gradually lost its Seattle character and became something more country and western as the eastern plateau opened up. Snow on the ground from Ellensburg east. Real snow. The committed kind. Nicole had never been to eastern Washington. She watched the landscape change through the passenger window, with the focused attention she brought to unfamiliar things. Not performing interest, genuinely rearranging her picture of the state she'd lived in for 3 years. "It's flat," she said, "somewhere around Moses Lake. The west side has topographical opinions," he said. "The east side doesn't bother. I like it." He glanced at her. Profile. The red jacket she'd worn to the farmer's market. Her coffee cooling in her hand because she always forgot to drink it while she was looking at things. He thought about the first time he'd driven this stretch. After Rebecca. Moving boxes from Spokane to Seattle, the engagement over, the future he'd been building, dismantled to its components. He'd been driving west, toward something new and unformed, and the flat eastern landscape had felt like it was watching him leave without judgment. Now he was driving east, bringing something back. He didn't say any of that. Just drove. She fell asleep somewhere around Ritzville, her head finding the window, her coffee finally abandoned in the cup holder. He turned the radio down. Drove the last hour in quiet. Snow country going by outside. Nicole asleep in the passenger seat with complete trust in his ability to get them there. That was a thing, the trust of someone sleeping in your car. He'd had it before. Passengers who fell asleep. It wasn't unprecedented, but this was different. This was her. And the difference was total. Ruth met them at the door. She was 62. Silver hair, practical cut. The face of a woman who had spent 30 years as an elementary school librarian and developed, through professional necessity, an accurate, rapid assessment of character. She looked at Nicole for exactly 3 seconds, then she held out her hand. "I'm Ruth. Come in before you freeze." She led them inside, took their coats, directed them toward the kitchen, where something smelled like cinnamon and the warmth of a house that had been cooking since morning. Timothy's father, Gerald, was in the living room watching the Weather Channel with the focused attention of a man who had decided to respect weather as an opponent. He was 64, retired from the post office 2 years ago, still figuring out what retired people were supposed to do with their mornings. He shook Timothy's hand, then turned to Nicole. "I hear you're a nurse, pediatrics," she said. "Tough work, good work." Gerald nodded. Apparently this was sufficient. He turned back to the Weather Channel. Kathy caught Nicole's eye over his father's shoulder. She had the expression of someone who had just been offered something unexpectedly easy after preparing for something hard. He smiled. She shook her head slightly, the involuntary smile thing, and followed Ruth to the kitchen. Ruth's pointed question arrived on Christmas Eve. They were in the kitchen after dinner, the men in the living room. Nicole was drying dishes. Ruth was washing. He was in the living room with Gerald, also watching the Weather Channel, apparently a household commitment, when he heard the sounds of the conversation shift. Not the words, the tones. Ruth's voice measured and direct, Nicole's voice pausing, then steady, then something that might have been a laugh. Short and real. He didn't go check, he trusted it. 20 minutes later, Nicole came back with 2 glasses of wine and sat next to him on the couch, her leg against his. "What did she ask you?" he said quietly. "She asked if I thought you were ready." He felt the question land somewhere tender. "What did you say?" "I said I thought you'd been ready for a while. That you'd just been waiting to be sure you weren't repeating something." Nicole looked at her wine. She said that sounded like him, and she smiled when she said it, like it was a thing she recognized, a beat. "Then she asked if I was ready, and I said yes." She looked at him, direct, uncomplicated. The Nicole version of "I mean this." Without the pause, he put his hand over hers. Gerald said something to the television about a low-pressure system moving in from the coast. Ruth came in with cookies. His father eventually left the Weather Channel to play a card game that nobody won definitively, because Gerald modified the rules mid-game without announcement, which was apparently an established tradition that Ruth tolerated with the equanimity of someone who had made peace with a thing decades ago. Nicole caught on to Gerald's rule modifications around the third hand, and began making her own adjustments preemptively, which resulted in Gerald looking at her with something approaching respect. "She cheats back," he told Timothy, as though this was a significant character reference. "I'm aware," Timothy said. "Good," Gerald said, and modified another rule: January cold. The particular Seattle gray that settled in after New Year's and committed to February. The bookstore was slower, post-holiday inventory, the returns and the remainder sorting. Timothy liked January in the store. The quieter pace, the chance to read between customers, the way the place felt more like itself without the seasonal traffic. Nicole picked up extra shifts. January was not slow in pediatrics. She came home on more evenings with the dense quiet, and he had soup ready more often, and the crackers never stopped. He did not mind the hard parts. That was the thing he understood about it now. He did not mind the hard parts. Not because they weren't hard, but because the hard parts were real. They were the actual texture of a life shared with a person who had a demanding, necessary job and a full self and history and weight. Minding the hard parts would have meant wanting a version of Nicole that was edited for comfort. He didn't want that version. They had their first real fight in late January, not about anything important. That was the thing about first real fights. The subject rarely matched the stakes. The subject was the heat. Nicole ran warm. Timothy ran cold. These facts had always been true and had always required accommodation. But the accommodation system, he set it to 66 at night. She turned it to 69 at 3 a.m. on cold nights. He turned it back in the morning. They never discussed it. Had been built for roommates, not for 2 people who were now occasionally waking up in the same bed. The fight started at 7 a.m. on a Saturday when he came back to bed after coffee, and she was awake and had opinions about the fact that he'd turned the thermostat down on his way back. "It was 69, she said. "I was warm. You're always warm after coffee." "It's 69 degrees, Nicole. It's January, in Seattle. Not in Minnesota. I'm cold. You have 4 blankets. That's not the same thing as ambient temperature, Timothy. Ambient temperature is." "I know what ambient temperature is." She sat up. He sat down. And the thing about the thermostat fight was that it wasn't about the thermostat. It was about the fact that this was the first genuinely irritated conversation they'd had since everything changed. And neither of them had a map for it yet. He knew it wasn't about the thermostat. She probably knew it too. They were both talking about the thermostat anyway. I'm not asking you to be uncomfortable, she said. I'm asking for 68, and it's been fine for 9 months. We weren't. She stopped. Something moved through her face. It's different now. A beat. Yes, he said. Quieter. It is. They looked at each other across the Saturday morning bed. 67, he said. 68, 67 and a half. That's not a number the thermostat has. I'll round up at night. You round down in the morning. She looked at him for a moment. That's extremely reasonable, she said, in a tone that suggested she'd been prepared for it not to be reasonable and had not yet fully updated. I'm a reasonable person, he said. You set it to 66. I set it to 66 at 7 a.m. in January, as one data point in a longer pattern of being a reasonable person. She pressed her lips together. He could see the involuntary smile trying to get out. She was losing the battle. This is a very mature conversation about heating. We're very mature people. We absolutely are not. We're trying to be. She grabbed a pillow and put it over her face and made a sound that was half frustration and half law. He lay back down. She put the pillow down. They were quiet for a moment. I hate that you were reasonable, she said. I know. I had a whole position prepared. I'm sure it was thorough. It involved a chart, a temperature chart, of the last 3 weeks. With annotations, he turned his head to look at her. She was looking at the ceiling. He could see the corner of her mouth. Nicole, yeah. You made a 3-week temperature chart for an argument. I made it before I knew it was going to be an argument. I made it out of general interest. That's extremely you. I'm aware. A beat. 67 and a half, she said. 67 and a half, he agreed. She turned onto her side to face him. The January light was thin and pale through the blinds, and she looked like herself, unguarded and slightly annoyed and completely, specifically, irreplaceably herself. First fight, she said, about the thermostat. We were always going to fight about the thermostat, I know. It was inevitable, completely. So, she looked at him. Now what? He reached over and pushed a strand of hair off her face. Slowly. The way you touched something you wanted to keep being allowed to touch. Now nothing. Now we've had the thermostat fight and we know what it feels like, and we know we can get through it, and we set it to 67 and a half, and we keep going. She watched his face. That's it? That's it? No aftermath? No aftermath. She was quiet for a moment, processing the idea that conflict didn't require a rebuilding period. That the work of getting back to normal could simply be deciding to be normal. Huh, she said. Yeah, okay, she settled. Her head found the space on his shoulder. 67 and a half, every day, he said. From now until we renegotiate, she laughed. Short and real. Pressed it into his shoulder. He held her with the ease of a man who had stopped monitoring how tightly he was allowed to hold on. February brought rain, and then more rain, and then a week of ice that shut down half the city with the specific Seattle drama of a place that had not adequately prepared for winter, despite winter arriving on schedule every year. The bookstore was closed for 2 days. Nicole's hospital was not closed for anything. She got there and back via the ingenuity of a woman who had grown up in Tacoma and knew how to navigate roads the city had given up on. He tracked her commute on the ice days with the vigilance of a man who understood he was not allowed to be anxious about it out loud, and chose instead to be anxious about it quietly and have soup operational at various temperature levels, depending on estimated arrival time. She texted from the parking lot each evening. Always the same 2 words. Made it. He texted back. Good. Soup's hot. He didn't say. I thought about you the whole drive. He didn't say. I checked the road conditions 4 times. He didn't say. The apartment feels like a waiting room when you're out in weather like this. He said. Soup's hot. She said. You're going to turn me into a person who relies on things. He said. Too late. She sent back a single period, which he had learned was Nicole's way of communicating a thing that was too true and too important for her to make a joke about. Just a period. Just yes. Just received. He saved that text. Not consciously, he just didn't delete it. And later, going through his phone for unrelated reasons, he found it. And the period sat there looking like everything it had meant to say. The lease renewal arrived on a Friday in March, yellow envelope. Clement Street Property Management printed in the upper left corner. He found it in the mailbox on his way back from the store, tucked between a credit card offer and a furniture catalog, addressed to a previous tenant. He held it for a moment, stood in the lobby with the yellow envelope, and felt the weight of a document that was, on its surface, entirely administrative. 1 year. He'd been in this apartment for 1 year in April. Nicole had moved in 9 months ago. They'd spent 6 of those months being what they'd called safe, and 4 months being what they actually were. He took the envelope upstairs. Nicole was home. Post-shift, the lighter version. She'd changed out of scrubs into the Portland State sweatshirt, the sounds of her doing something in the kitchen reaching him before he opened the door. She was making coffee. 10 p.m. She did this on late shift weeks when her schedule had inverted and her body had not fully agreed with the inversion. He set the envelope on the table. She saw it. Read the return address. Looked up. Her face did several things in sequence. Recognition, then something cautious, then the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to let him see that she was feeling something. She let him see it. Lease renewal, he said. I see that. Timothy, the dry version of his name. The one that meant, I know what it is. Proceed to the actual point. He sat down at the table. The same table where they'd eaten eggs the morning after. The same Idaho chip on the counter, catching the kitchen light. She poured her coffee, leaned against the counter in the way she sometimes did when she needed to be standing to think. Do you want to open it? She said. I thought we'd open it together. She set down her coffee. Crossed to the table, sat across from him. He slid the envelope toward her. She slid it back. He opened it. 2 pages. Standard renewal language. 12-month term. Signature lines at the bottom for both listed tenants. Both listed tenants, the apartment had always been both their names. From the beginning, when Nicole had signed on as a co-tenant because the owner had required it, because a single bookstore manager's income had not been sufficient on its own. Both names on the lease. Both names on the mailbox placard. Timothy Marsh, Nicole Whitfield. Those names had meant something administrative for 9 months. They meant something different now. He looked at the signature line, then at her. She was already looking at him. The nurse's face was off. This was just Nicole. The unguarded version, the one he'd been accumulating evidence of for months. The one that let him see the full range of what was moving behind her eyes. Still want to live with me, he said. Not a big question. Except it was the biggest question. Because it contained the other questions. All of them. The whole architecture of what they'd been building. Compressed into 8 words and 2 people sitting at a kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Friday in March, as your roommate, she said carefully, testing the edges of it the way she had before. The same exchange, the callback they both recognized. He reached into the junk drawer, the 3rd drawer from the left, the one where everything without a specific home ended up, and found a pen. The black one. Put it on the table between them. As my girlfriend, he said. She looked at the pen, looked at him. He held her gaze. Didn't qualify it. Didn't wrap it in anything softer. Just said the thing he meant, plainly, the way she'd taught him to by doing it herself, over and over, in 100 small declarative sentences, over the course of a life they'd been building in the same 1,200 square feet. She picked up the pen. She signed. He took the pen. Signed below her name. The 2 signatures sat side by side on the page. Timothy Marsh. Nicole Whitfield. The same 2 names that had been on the mailbox, on the original lease, on all the administrative surfaces of a year that had turned out to be entirely unadministrative underneath. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. March rain tapped at the window. The tulips, a new set, 4th or 5th by now, always yellow, always the mason jar, leaned toward the window with the confidence of things that knew where the light was. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She stood up, came around the table and held out her hand. Palm up, fingers open, the gesture of someone who was done with the symbolic distance of sitting across from each other. He took it. She pulled him up from the chair. I want to tell you something, she said. Okay, I've moved 4 times in 6 years. Seattle, Tacoma, back to Seattle, this apartment. She looked at their hands. Every time I moved, I told myself the next place would be temporary too. Just until something more permanent came along. She raised her eyes to his. I stopped thinking about this place as temporary around month 4. He said nothing. Just listened. I didn't tell myself why, she said. I just noticed that I'd stopped looking at apartment listings and stopped calculating what I'd do if the lease ended. I just stopped planning the exit, a beat. I didn't let myself look at why until November. November, he said. Tuesday. November. A man came home with tulips. The rain on the window. The refrigerator. The amber lamp she'd turned on when she came home. Same lamp, same corner. Same warm circle of light they'd been sitting inside for months, without stopping to name how much they'd needed it. I want to stay, she said. Not because of the lease. Because this is home. Her fingers pressed against his. Your home. This apartment is 400 square feet under our actual minimum, and the door handle is loose and the radiator is having some kind of ongoing personal crisis. And it's home. He put his free hand on her face. She leaned into it. Eyes closing for a moment, the small trust of that. The same way she'd tilted into the first kiss on the couch in November. Not falling. Just choosing to lean. I want to stay too, he said. And then, because this was them, the radiator, he said, is not having a personal crisis. It's just old. She opened her eyes. It sounds like it's working through something. It's cast iron. Cast iron doesn't process emotion. Everything processes emotion if it lives with us long enough. He laughed. She did too. Their foreheads came together the way they did now. Not a gesture, just a fact. The way two people find a resting point after repeated practice. Sign the papers, she said. I already signed the papers. Then take the papers to the door so we don't forget to mail them. You are so romantic. I'm practical. Extremely. She pulled back, took the signed lease off the table, walked to the entryway, and placed it precisely in the blue ceramic bowl by the door. The one she'd found at the thrift store in the U District on a random Wednesday in month 2 and declared perfect. Where it would wait for the Monday morning mail without being forgotten. Administrative. Ordinary, completely necessary. He watched her do it. She straightened and turned and found him watching and did not look away. Let him look. Let him see the whole of what was in her face, which was everything, which was the full, unedited Nicole, which was the thing he'd been accumulating evidence for since before he'd known what he was collecting. Music, she said. Now? We should celebrate. It's 10 p.m. It's Friday. We have neighbors. We have a signed lease and the rest of our lives, she said. Turn on the music, Timothy. He went to the small Bluetooth speaker on the bookshelf, the one she'd bought because his phone speaker habit offended her sensibilities, and scrolled through Earth, Wind, and Fire, the one they'd referenced but never actually played together. He pressed play. September came through the speaker at a reasonable neighbor-considerate volume, and Nicole Whitfield. 29 years old, pediatric nurse, practical person, woman who kept a 3-week temperature chart out of general interest, began to move in the kitchen the way she moved when she thought no one was paying attention. Except he was paying attention. He crossed the kitchen. She was already turning toward him when he reached her, already laughing, already in the joyful self-consciousness that he had catalogued in her from a distance for 9 months and was now allowed to stand directly inside. He put his hands on her waist. She put her hands on his shoulders. They danced in the kitchen of a 400-square-foot apartment in Seattle with a loose door handle and a radiator with strong feelings and a mason jar of yellow tulips on the counter and a signed lease in the blue bowl by the door. She nearly took out the garbage can. He caught her, his hands at her waist, pulling her back from the domestic property damage, and she looked up at him laughing and slightly breathless, and in the amber kitchen light with September playing at neighbor-considerate volume, she looked like the truest version of herself, which it was, he had come to understand, also the truest version of home. I wouldn't have turned you down, she said. She said it the same way she'd said it the first time, in this kitchen, with rain on the window and tulips in a jar and everything possible still unrealized. Except it wasn't the same at all, because the first time she'd said it, with her hands gripping the counter and her face going pink, and the specific terror of someone who had let a true thing out before they were ready, now she said it the way you said a thing that had been proven. Not a confession. A fact, I know, he said. I'm going to keep saying it. I know that too, she smiled. The real one, the uncontrollable one. The one had been cataloging since month 2 under the incorrect label of just Nicole being Nicole. As if that wasn't already the most important thing in the room. He kissed her in the kitchen with September playing, and the tulips watching, and the signed lease in the blue bowl by the door, and the thermostat set to 67.5 degrees and the radiator doing whatever the radiator did. Outside, Seattle did what Seattle did in March. Rain on the windows. The gray of a city that had been standing in this weather since before anyone currently standing in it had arrived, and would keep standing in it long after. And inside the lamp was on, and the door was locked, and nobody was pretending anything. There was a night in January, after the thermostat fight, before the lease renewal, when Timothy had been closing up the bookstore alone, the last customer out at 8:15, and he'd stood in the quiet shop with the lights on, and the street dark outside, and thought about the year with an accuracy that surprised him. He'd come to Seattle with boxes of things from the life he'd been dismantling, books and clothes and kitchen equipment, and the weight of a man who had been wrong about something large enough to reshape him. He'd unpacked the boxes into a small apartment he couldn't afford alone, and he'd been managing. That was the right word. Managing. Getting through the days with competence and without drama, and without the old version of himself that he'd decided was probably better left in storage. And then a woman had knocked on his door on a Wednesday, and asked if the bathroom had mold. And everything after that had been, not a plan, not a recovery arc, not the kind of story that built toward a moral. Just a life. The actual specific, unrepeatable life of a man who had found that what he needed was not what he'd been looking for, that the person who would stay was not the person he'd been performing for. That home was not a destination you planned, but a fact you arrived at, quietly, through the accumulation of 1,000 ordinary moments that mattered more than you knew they did while they were happening. He turned off the lights in the bookstore and locked the door and walked home through the January dark. She'd had the lamp on. He'd come through the door. Key, slight lift on the handle, and she was on the couch, with a book held too close, and she'd looked up when he came in with the ease of someone who had long since stopped wondering whether this was a thing that would last. He'd taken off his coat. She'd gone back to her book. He'd made tea. And that was it. That was the whole night. That was what it looked like from the outside, when everything was exactly right. 2 people and a lamp and tea, and the radiator keeping its private calendar and the tulips on the counter and the door that stuck unless you knew the trick. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that required a soundtrack. Just the ordinary fact of a life that had become real. He carried it home in his chest every night, like a thing he'd found and recognized. Not something he'd built to specification. Not something he'd been promised. Just the irreplaceable fact of Nicole Whitfield in his apartment in Seattle, waking up on the right side of the right door, drinking coffee he'd left on the counter, sending him 2 words from parking lots in the ice. Made it. He thought about that sometimes. The double meaning of it. Made it home. Made it through. Made it. The whole thing, together, out of nothing more or less than showing up on purpose. That was what it was. That was all it had ever needed to be.